Welcome back. This is Church in the World Part 2, and this is our discussion about the death penalty. It's the third part of that discussion. We're concluding today with commitments of the church. Now, I'm going to go in broad strokes. This is, of course, from the ELC's statement on the death penalty, pages 4 through the conclusion. I'm going to go quite quickly here because there's a lot of material to cover, but a lot of it we've already kind of hinted at. The church, as a community gathered in faith, makes a commitment to welcoming everyone affected by violent crime, including those who are offenders, including families of offenders or victims, including people who work in criminal justice and their families, recognizing the burden that accompanies that kind of work. As a church in daily life, we offer ministries of healing and reconciliation to all affected. We recognize and affirm ministries that announce the good news to the imprisoned and their families. We encourage ministries conducted by people through their work in the criminal justice system, etc. Right? As a community of moral deliberation, we are going to continue to talk about things like criminal justice and the ways in which it interplays with concerns around racism, poverty, abuse, chemical dependency. We recognize that we need to continue deliberating what is best and how we can best serve our neighbor in these cases. As a church organized for mission, we recognize the government bears responsibility for protecting people, and we support the government in the exercise of this function. Now, we also know the church is called to be by God to be a creative critic of the social order and to speak on behalf of justice, peace, and order. And so we urge the abolition of the death penalty and support alternative and appropriate punishment for capital crime, including the possibility of life sentence without parole. We call for an ongoing reform of criminal justice system, seeking means of incapacitation that protect citizens while limiting violence and holding open the possibilities for conversion and restoration, and for education and future responsible citizenship. We direct state public policy offices to work against the death penalty and for alternative and appropriate punishment for capital crime. We ask congregations, etc., to support the work of the state advocacy offices of the Lutheran Church. We seek ways to work with our ecumenical partners to the same ends. What are the asks here? First, we're a community. We have all sorts of people in this faith community, people affected by violent crime through any number of ways, people interact with in any number of ways. All of those people are welcome, and all of those experiences are important for us to remember and to hold in prayer. We also do ministry in daily life with, for, and as all those groups of persons. And we recognize that healing and reconciliation is the ministry of the church, right? So it's really important because that's the way in which the church is not a retributive agency, right? The church is not here to judge people and pass judgment and pass down penalties. But the church is also here to deliberate how we want to exist as a society. And as we look, as we've said, at the death penalty, we see that this just doesn't work, right? We need to figure out what does work. The role of the criminal justice system and the function of punishment and the causes and effects of criminal behavior, we've got to continue studying them. We've got to continue looking at them. But it's pretty clear they're not as simple as the current policies in politics of our nation portray. It's just not that easy. It's just not that simple. And that's okay. Human beings are complex creatures, and we have complicated minds and we have complicated lives. There's nothing wrong with that. So the church is going to continue to talk about these things, and we'll see some of that in later social statements as we go through this season of Easter and talking about being church in the world. The church recognizes that the government is responsible ultimately for protecting people. That's really important, actually, and some circles have kind of lost the thread of that. The Christian confession is the government is there to protect people. So one, if the government's hurting people, that's a huge problem that needs to be justified because pretty much that's the opposite of the government's obvious function. But second, there is, at least in America, sometimes a narrative the government's not there to protect you, like it's not the government's problem. That is never true. The government exists to protect people. That is its function. It serves that end. And insofar as it fails that end, it fails at being government. There's not a lot of room for flex around that in the Christian church. No matter what one thinks of the death penalty, as I've said, the government has authority to do all sorts of things, but only when the government is exercising that authority for the purpose the government has the authority in the first place. And we'll talk about that in our appendix tomorrow, the definition of government and where we get it from as Lutherans. To that end, because it serves in no way can be demonstrated that the death penalty makes anyone safer or better, we urge the abolition of the death penalty. Now, that's really interesting because I can tell you, in full honesty, I did not know this was the position of the ELCA until I read the social statement when I was in seminary. It's not something the ELCA seems to have really taken seriously, and that's something I wonder about. And maybe that's something that we could talk about together or think about together. How do we work this? How do we also direct public policy offices to seek reform for criminal justice system, change the way we do incapacitation, think about ways we can find alternative punishments, think about ways that we can find opportunities for reform rather than turn everything into being about judgment. So I want to pause there and say this has been a week of heavy topics, and unfortunately, they're probably going to get more heavy and more complex. As I've been doing this series, something has happened, which is I've realized there are going to be social statements. I don't regard so far what I've discussed as being particularly problematic. I think that social statements that we've covered thus far are fairly obvious and balanced, and I'm not familiar with any well-argued disagreements with their conclusions in our contexts. Take the death penalty. I took a class called The Cross and the Sword in seminary, which delved into all sorts of Christian responses, not to the death penalty, but specifically, but to the idea of the government being able to commit any sort of act of violence at all, whether that was abortion or death penalty or war. And the reason that those themes were added together is because for most of Christian history, we have treated them as the same thing, a thing that ends a human. And abortion, of course, at that time was mostly infanticide, right? It wasn't killing a child in the womb. Even though the child could be carried to term and was nearly able to survive outside the womb, right? Which is the circumstance under which I would call that killing a child. No, it's instead what happens is that Christians think of any process that ends a human life as ending a human life, as murder. And so that's where the ELCA gets this language that the church is always life-affirming and seeking to protect life. And it's really difficult to imagine these arguments where we get this idea that the state can actually violate this idea and actually can justify doing violence against somebody and ending a human life is something I'll talk about in the appendix. If you're interested, that's tomorrow. But in the meantime, what I want you to think about is, what are the questions that this has raised for you? Where are the struggles happening for you? Am I going too fast? Is this not grounded enough in obvious scripture for you? Should I read some more of the scriptural content that's in the background documents or even in the documents themselves? For me, what this has brought up is the statements, as I said, that are going to be much more tense. There are going to be statements that if you thought these were controversial or difficult, are going to blow our socks off. So when we get to those, please keep in mind that I'm doing my best to report what the statement says and explain in the best possible light the logic behind these statements. There may come a time when I have to do a video or two, probably as an appendix or an epilogue, where we talk about whether or not these statements do live up to what they want to be. And so I hope you'll look forward to that as well. Well, I'm already coming up against my time, and I'm aware that it is a Saturday. So I hope that this has been helpful for you. Please join me again for part 3, starting on Monday. And until then, God bless. Take care.